My name is Bill Patchane. I'm the Executive Director for the APDA of Massachusetts. I want to welcome everybody to today's presentation on workplace accommodation with the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. We're really happy about today's presentation. And so I'm just going to cover a few administrative things to start the presentation, and I'll turn it over to our two wonderful presenters today. And so if you could just move to the next slide, please. So today, what I'd like to do is just cover a few administrative points. The APDA in Massachusetts has been in operation for decades, and we offer programs and services to the PD community here in Massachusetts and surrounding states. We've received a large response for today's presentation, a lot of feedback leading up to it, saying that this is something that is incredibly important to the PD community. Over the course of the last 5 years, there's been a tremendous amount of progress in the understanding and treating of Parkinson's disease. As you all may know, Parkinson's disease is highly individualized from person to person, and not all that is discussed today is relevant to everyone. The healthcare team, and it's very important for you to put a healthcare team together, must be familiar with signs and symptoms, treatment strategies, and how Parkinson's disease impacts the individual patient. Treating Parkinson's disease well requires a team approach. Today, we are providing information that is not intended as medical or legal advice. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the APDA of Massachusetts operates an information and referral center. It's at BU Medical Campus. The phone number is 617-638-8466. You can call, get answers to some questions. You can be provided with referral information and be engaged with resources. Here in Massachusetts, we also provide education and support. We've got a wide range of support groups now being delivered virtually. We offer symposium educational events on a regular basis. From a health and wellness standpoint, we have exercise and movement classes that include dance, yoga, tai chi, boxing, and more. We have fitness professionals training program, and we operate here at BU Sargent College, the APDA National Rehabilitation Resource Center. And so what I'd like to do today is introduce you to our two incredibly important speakers for today's presentation. APDA is grateful for having many great presenters that engage with APDA, and we have a few today that are outstanding partners to the APDA. Alex and Ann also help APDA navigate circumstances on a regular basis. Today's presentation is an important topic of workplace accommodation. Alex serves on the board and Ann serves as a partner, both of which we interact with and have for a long time on a regular basis, not only to answer questions for those with Parkinson's disease, but help us with recommendations and strategy. Today's presenters are Alexandra Alex Deal, who has a JD and is a partner at Paik, Brewington Deal, LLP, a Boston-based law firm, and Ann Muskopf, who is a OTRL, director of the Charlotte and Richard Okonow Parkinson Family Support Program. Today, Alex and Ann will discuss how individuals with Parkinson's can continue to work with the aid of workplace accommodations. What we'll be doing at the very end is taking some questions. If you have questions along the way, please chat those questions in either the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we'll reserve some time at the very end for Ann and Alex to answer those questions. And so what I'd like to do now is introduce Alex Deal and start the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill, and hi, everybody. As Bill said, I am an attorney here in Boston, although as you can see today, and probably like most of you, I'm working out of my home. So if there are any interloping children or pets. I apologize in advance for that. I'm going to talk to you today about workplace accommodation from a legal perspective. It's important that I let you know that nothing I'm saying here is legal advice. So to the extent you have specific questions about your situation, you should definitely consult an attorney. What I'm trying to do is give you an overview to give you some tools so that you can have all the information necessary in order for you to make a good decision about your individual workplace situation. So if Anne, I could get the next slide, please. So the main law that covers accommodation in the workplace is called the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's a federal law, and it protects individuals with disabilities in the workplace. In the employment context, what that means is that it prohibits employers from discriminating against qualified individuals because of a disability. And it also requires employers to provide what we call reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities. For those of you who are joining us in Massachusetts, Massachusetts also has something called the Fair Employment Practices Law, which largely mirrors the ADA. So pretty much everything I say here today is also applicable in Massachusetts, and where there are some differences, I'll be pointing those out to you as well. Next slide, please. So the first question we need to ask is which employers are actually covered under the ADA. And the employers the ADA covers are those who employ 15 or more employees on the payroll. There are some exceptions, which are listed here. Employers who are not engaged in an industry affecting interstate commerce, that's a bit of legal jargon, sorry about that. The United States government, Indian tribes, and certain tax-exempt private membership clubs. Next slide, Ann. For US government employees, even though they're not covered under the ADA, they're covered under something called the Rehabilitation Act. And again, that act provides largely the same protections that the ADA provides. State and local government employers also fall under the ADA. For those of you in Massachusetts, if your employer has 6 or more employees, you are covered under the Massachusetts Fair Employment Practices Law. That also includes domestic workers, but it exempts nonprofit, social, fraternal, and religious organizations. So which individuals are covered under the ADA? It covers individuals who are qualified for the position in question. And I'll give you a bit more explanation in a little bit about what it means to be qualified for your position. And that definition applies to both employees. So if you're currently working in your job, this covers you, but also if you're applying for a new job and you're wondering whether it's something that you're going to be able to do and whether you're covered by the law, the ADA actually covers applicants as well. So in order to be a qualified individual under the ADA and also under the Fair Employment Practices Law, you have to have the skills, experience, education, and other job-related requirements necessary for the position, which is pretty much like any job that you're going to apply for. But also in this particular context, you have to be able to perform what we call the essential functions of your job with or without a reasonable accommodation. Essential functions of the job are really just fundamental job duties. So some examples or some things to think about when you're thinking about whether a function of your job is essential is whether removing it would fundamentally change the nature of your job, whether it's something your employer considers to be essential, whether it's written in a job description, if you have a written job description, the amount of time that you spend in your job performing that function, if you're unionized, whether it's a term in your collective bargaining agreement, work experience of people who have performed your job prior to you, and also the current work experience of people who perform jobs similar to you. So how does the law define disability? Under the ADA, a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So here's a list of physical impairments. The physical impairments are defined as any physiological disorder or condition, cosmetic disfigurement, or anatomical loss affecting one or more body systems. And as you can see, it's pretty much every body system that you have. Certainly people on this webinar are far more qualified to tell you whether your condition would qualify, but these are some of the examples of systems that might be affected by a physical impairment. The law also covers mental impairments, which include mental or psychological disorders, so an intellectual disability, an organic brain syndrome, which means reduced mental function because of disease rather than psychological problems, emotional or mental illness, and specific learning disabilities. And here again is a whole list of major life activities. So if you recall, I said that a disability would be something that substantially limits your ability to participate in a major life activity or to perform a major life activity. And there are a whole host of examples here, but it's really pretty much anything that you do on a daily basis that is important to your day-to-day functioning. Next slide. Major life activities also include the operation of major bodily functions. So it's not just walking, standing, sitting, breathing, et cetera, the things you saw in the prior slide. It's also the functions of your system. So if your particular disability impairs your ability to, or impairs your system's ability to function, then that may also fall under the definition of an impairment of a major life activity. So what happens if you're a qualified individual, you have this disability, and you are looking for help from your employer because you still want to be able to work, you still want to be able to function, or you're applying for a new job and you're excited about the job and you just want to make sure that it's something you're able to do with your particular condition. That's when we start to talk about reasonable accommodations in the workplace. And that's a really important word to keep in mind because it's really the crux of the ADA in the workplace. Covered employees have to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities. That includes, again, both applicants and employees, unless doing so would cause an undue hardship to the employer. A reasonable accommodation is really just a change in the workplace, or application process that helps make it possible for you to perform or apply for the job. So here are some common accommodation situations, and this is where it gets very fact specific. My co-presenter, Anne, is going to be talking to you about some very specific things from an OT perspective that may be reasonable accommodations in the workplace. But I'm trying here to just give you an overview of things that you might be talking with your employer about, or things that you might be thinking about if you're having some difficulty and think that you may need an accommodation. So one of the things is attendance, which is simply just changing your schedule or potentially granting a leave of absence, depending on if you need to be out for any particular length of time. You could also think about modifying your work schedule, which may mean flexible start or stop times. It might mean actually reassigning a shift to a different time. For example, if you find yourself getting very tired, in the afternoons, maybe you can shift your schedule a little bit earlier to accommodate that. And it may also be a temporary shift change. Sometimes it involves job restructuring, which might mean reallocating certain functions, although never essential functions, but reallocating certain functions of your job to different employees or colleagues of yours, and changing when and how an essential function is performed. You also might consider a light duty job. So if your particular disability has made it difficult for you to perform more strenuous tasks, then you might be able to ask your employer whether a light duty position is possible. Often light duty positions will be transitional or temporary. It's not likely to be something that's long-term. And your employer is not required to turn this temporary light duty position into a permanent position. They're also not required to create light duty jobs in order to enable you to return to the job if you've been off for some reason. One of the things that's also not listed here that Anne's going to talk a little bit more specifically about is just actual modifications to your workspace. So maybe getting a different keyboard or a different setup that would help you be more comfortable while you're at work. And finally, for those of you who are in Massachusetts, where marijuana is legal, an employer can grant your request to accommodate the medical use of marijuana outside of the workplace. So you won't ever be granted a request to use marijuana in the workplace. But certainly if your doctor has prescribed it and it's something that helps you maybe alleviate pain or something along those lines, that is something that you can discuss with your employer here in Massachusetts as a reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodations do not include eliminating or reallocating any essential function of the job. lowering any production standards of quality or quantity, providing items for general daily living. So that may mean, a prosthetic limb or a wheelchair, something that you would need outside of the workplace, or promoting any person as an accommodation. So what does your employer have to do once they get an accommodation request? Well, that request will actually typically come from you, the individual. Employers aren't required to speculate about whether you need an accommodation. So the first thing you should do is you should approach your employer, typically human resources, on occasion your manager, and let them know that you need a reasonable accommodation. Sometimes a third party can make the request. So it may be a spouse or a caretaker who would make that request. And it can be delivered orally or in writing. And there are no magic words that you need to use. It's certainly helpful if you let your employee know that you're looking for or your employer, I'm sorry, know that you're looking for an accommodation. But you don't have to use those words to be protected by the law. Once you make the request, the employer has to engage with you in what is called an interactive process. And this is actually, I have seen in my practice, typically where things tend to go a little awry, because often an employee requests an accommodation, an employer is unable to meet that request for some business related reason, and the process stops. And that's really not what is supposed to happen. What's supposed to happen is that the employer and the employee engage in a dialogue about how best to respond to the employee's need for an accommodation. So the person who's requesting the accommodation should provide the employer with enough information about his or her disability in order to determine what kind of accommodation is reasonable. And the employer has to explore all the potential accommodations and eventually provide an employee with an appropriate one, unless there really is no accommodation for that particular employee. And both of the people in this process, both the employer and the individual, need to participate in that process in good faith. So for each accommodation request, your employer may require documentation from you. It's never going to be too specific. I know that that's a concern of a lot of people, in terms of not wanting to, pardon me, sorry about that, not wanting to, reveal a diagnosis or give too much medical information, and that's fine. But your employer can, at a minimum, require you to provide documentation on the existence of the disability and the need for a reasonable accommodation. And that's where your healthcare providers come in. You can see them, you can get documentation from them, and often, as Anne's going to talk to you about, you can get actually specific recommendations for what kinds of accommodations might work best for you. But bear in mind that your employers are not required to give you the specific accommodation that you're requesting. So as I was just discussing with respect to the interactive process, they're required to talk to you about what accommodation might meet your needs, but there's no specific thing that they have to provide you. So it's all a process, and it's also an ongoing process. So if you find that you get an accommodation and it's not working for you, or you need an additional accommodation, the employer's responsibility is ongoing. And they have to continue to have that dialogue with you in order to make sure that you're being appropriately accommodated. So if you feel that you're not being appropriately accommodated, or if you feel that your employer is not following the law or discriminating against you on the basis of your disability, or has retaliated against you for requesting an accommodation, you do have options. I would encourage you to consult with a lawyer before figuring out what option is right for you, but you can file a charge at either the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or here in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. And that's just the first administrative step that you take prior to filing any sort of court action or anything along those lines. If it is the case that it really is not in your best interest or the employer's best interest to accommodate you, and if it simply isn't possible, if you find that the accommodations still aren't enabling you to do your job in a way that feels satisfying to you, and you're still having difficulty, there are also other options in terms of disability. So for example, your employer may have a long-term disability policy. You may have a private long-term disability policy. And there are also, there's disability available from the government. And that's another thing I would certainly encourage you to consult an attorney on. There are attorneys who deal very specifically with disability related issues. And those are things that they can help you navigate because they too have very specific requirements. But you're not without options. So I would encourage you to talk with your family members, talk with your doctors, figure out in your particular situation what may be necessary for you. And I hope that this information is helpful in getting you there.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was very helpful. So again, I'm Ann Muskopf, and I am the director of the Charlotte and Richard Okonow Parkinson's Family Support Program. There we go. So just wanted to take a brief interlude to introduce our programs. We really enjoy and love working side by side with the APDA to provide information and referral and a quarterly education and support group. And in this time of COVID-19, we practice our social distancing with our chorus, as well as our social dancing with our dance program. We're also happy to offer 4 different care partner support groups and new to the pandemic, an adult child support group. So certainly if any of these are interesting to you, please reach out to me. I'll be happy to share my contact information. So for those of you not as familiar with occupational therapy, contrary to popular belief, we're not going to help you find a job so much as I hope to explain, help you keep a job. Simply stated, occupational therapy helps people with health challenges to participate in daily life to the fullest. We work in a variety of settings, from hospitals to schools and in between and across the lifespan. And you might wonder how a profession can cover such a broad area. And the answer is that we are client-centered and look at things holistically. So we are very individualized. This presentation today, we're speaking in generalities, and of course, what may work very well for one person may not work for another, as it is with Parkinson's disease itself. And we also look at activities of daily living, as Alex referred to under a different name, ADLs. What we specialize in is what we call task analysis, or breaking something down to its component parts, and then looking at where the challenges are and seeking adaptations to help you live your best life and participate in these daily activities. So the heart of today's presentation, I want you to consider the employment with Parkinson's in terms of what are your challenges, physical, mental, etc. How do these challenges affect specific parts of the job performance? And then what variables affect your ability to perform them? So perhaps the most universal accommodation, as Alex also referred to, is a flexible schedule with Parkinson's. I'm sure many of you can identify with any of these bullet points here: bradykinesia, that's slowness of movement, medication on and off periods, sleep challenges, fatigue. I think we all have fatigue no matter what. Multiple medical and therapy appointments, challenges with using the bathroom, and depression and anxiety. And here's a cartoon here just for some laughs. I'd like to come in at 11, leave after lunch. Surely a progressive company like yours supports flex time. The point I'd like to make as well in this is what Alex referred to in the interactive process. It's important to speak with your employer about what this looks like and making sure you understand how time is tracked and that you still have a clear boundary between your work life and your personal life for your own mental health. Occupational therapists are also skilled in environmental modification. So when it comes to the mobility challenges associated with Parkinson's disease, some things I may find helpful are things like a parking spot that's either reserved or closer. The layout of the office, or workspace in proximity to, say, a door, a frequently used area such as a copy machine, etc., and bathrooms. A simple change of where you work might make a big difference. The trade-off, of course, is to realize that it may not be without a cost of, not being near your colleagues and things like that. So again, it's individualized. For those with jobs that require a lot of standing, things like floor coverings, anti-fatigue mats, may be helpful. Changing lighting, increasing general space. If someone's using a mobility device, such as a walker, having more space to maneuver may be something that could be done quite easily. Many places that are ADA compliant have automatic door openers, but perhaps you could take that a step further and request a remote control so that you don't have to maneuver over to the button and stand out of the way, or whatever the case may be. Rolling carts may be helpful if you're needing to carry items across a large area. And mobility aids, again, for large offices, warehouses, retail stores, things like that, that cover a lot more distance than your home, for example, may require the use of something like a power scooter to really save your energy and accomplish those job functions. Then referring to postural challenges that we know also come along with Parkinson's disease. This is where an ergonomic consultation may really be helpful. I think many people are familiar with the sit and stand desk. This one I pictured here happens to be motorized, which could be very helpful. Computer monitors, how they're adjusted for your neck, and making sure you don't have extra pain or issues with that, vision, for example. Seating support. I won't get into the probably tens of thousands of different chairs out there, but certainly having proper seating for lumbar support and arm support can be really helpful. And then depending again on the job, perhaps asking for a repetitive movement analysis would be helpful. This can not only help prevent injuries, but also help you with something we call energy conservation, which is, as it sounds, being able to save your energy for meaningful or important activities and reducing waste with movements. When it comes to fine motor challenges, this is where we talk about assistive technology, or ATEC. For many of us who have computer jobs, things like dictation software, for example, may be very helpful. This is more than just your average Siri on your iPhone. Something like Dragon Dictate or Dragon Naturally Speaking is really more sophisticated for word processing and things like that. Adaptive hardware, I've just set 2 examples here. For example, a mouse that's handheld with a trackball may be easier to use, or below that is a keyboard with an overlay called a key guard. So if extra strokes are something, dragging fingers are making it difficult to type, things like that might be helpful. I think you might be surprised actually at how many computer accessibility settings are already in programs such as Outlook or Microsoft. Things that can help decrease repeated keystrokes, have word prediction software, make the screen easier to see with contrast, or just helping use Outlook, with reminders and organization and to-do tasks and things like that. So in that case, asking for more additional training from your IT department may be as simple as it is. And then another, if you struggle with micrographia and reading your own handwriting, certainly a digital memo recorder may be helpful. If you live in the greater Boston area or central Massachusetts, it might be worth having your physician request a specialized OT evaluation for assistive technology, which around here is available at Spalding Rehab Hospital and also Easter Seals. It's an opportunity to try this technology before you request it from your employer. And then finally, the mental challenges, which are more challenging in the sense that they're often invisible disabilities. So things like having difficulty concentrating. Perhaps a white noise machine would be helpful. Or again, the office layout, having a door on your office instead of a cubicle, that may be helpful. Challenges with the executive function and organizing, perhaps an extra large calendar that can be hung in your office area. Having checklists, requesting a checklist from your boss about what's expected of you that day or that week or that month may be helpful. Certainly in this age of smartphones and computers, there are plenty of apps that may assist with that as well. And then I'd also just like to make the point that there's a digital versus analog certainly digital technology has a lot of features to it, but in some cases, maybe analog is really more helpful if you're more of a visual person. So again, it's very individualized. And finally, mental health. This is important for all of us, I think. You know, some places, including JF and CS, have a wellness room. You know, this is a location where the door can be closed, it can be reserved, the lights dimmed, comfortable seating, aromatherapy, these sorts of things when there's a stressful situation that you can go and take a 15-minute break and really try to calm yourself down. Many people are familiar with these days with apps to help with meditation. You've probably heard of Headspace and Calm. That's another mental health accommodation, and even a support animal that may be helpful. So finally, I'd like to just review a case study to try to bring this all together. This is Julie. She's a 56-year-old and was diagnosed with Parkinson's 6 years ago with foot cramps and a resting tremor. She works in accounts payable at her mid-sized corporate office. And she's finding it more difficult and time-consuming to reply to emails due to her tremor, and also prolonged sitting makes her feel stiff. She wants to remain active in her exercise groups, but loses steam by mid-afternoon. So when we consider someone like Julie, the things that come to my mind are things like the dictation software, or perhaps if her tremor is more unilateral, perhaps a one-handed keyboard that she could learn would be helpful. Certainly a sit-stand desk would be helpful in terms of the stiffness, you know, giving her the options of sitting or standing and changing positions while doing her work. An ergonomic chair to help with fatigue, even proper foot support that's often overlooked. The location of her desk, perhaps something to allow her more stretch breaks during the day and help her to remain active. A flexible schedule, as I mentioned at the beginning, to help with, say, physical therapy appointments or Botox treatments for her foot cramps. Those sorts of things may be helpful. And really just anything to optimize her best time of day, so that perhaps if she works part-time, instead of working 3 days a week, she works 4 shorter days or something like that. So, and then finally, I just wanted to direct you to a website, the Job Accommodation Network. It's askjan.org, and it's a wonderful resource. They have an entire page dedicated to Parkinson's disease, and it's organized by symptoms with drop-down menus of things that may help with each symptom. And then it has links for websites with those. And I will say it's a good starting place because some of the links are broken or maybe don't work or outdated, but it's good for generating ideas. But especially, you know, I would recommend requesting from your movement disorder specialist an OT evaluation, or perhaps assistive technology, to get those individualized recommendations. So I hope this gives you some ideas for your individualized and reasonable accommodations to help you continue to live your best life. And with that, I think we will move to our question and answer.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ann. Good. So I have a few questions for Alex and Ann. The first of which is, do you have any thoughts on when one should let the employer know that you've been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease?
Well, from my perspective, I think that it is important to let your employer know pretty much as soon as you feel like it is time for you to start exploring getting a reasonable accommodation. The process can be long because, as I mentioned before, it really is a process, right? It's a back and forth between you and your employer. It can take a little time to get something set up. It can also be the case that if you are having an employer procure, you know, one of these assistive devices that Ann's talked about, or if it's going to require some rescheduling, maybe moving an office, you know, changing around your coworkers' work schedules because yours is changing, anything along those lines. If it's going to require some juggling on the part of your employer, I would encourage you to do it probably sooner rather than later, just so that you can give the process time to work.
Yes, thank you. This question, I think Anne might be able to answer. I'd love to meet with an occupational therapist to talk about accommodation. What is the best way to do this or get the process started?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So that's where you would speak with your movement disorder specialist, or even your primary care doctor can make a referral for occupational therapy. Generally, you'd probably be looking for outpatient therapy. And you should make sure the referral indicates that it is for an evaluation related to returning, work accommodations, and specifically assistive technology, if that is something that you're interested in terms of working on a computer, because that is a very specialized component of occupational therapy. But it's as simple as a referral, and you're hopefully well on your way.
Good, thank you. So this is a lengthy question. So I am approaching disclosing my Parkinson's disease at work. I was diagnosed almost 6 years ago and now needing some accommodations. Currently, my entire group is work from home due to the pandemic. Return to office is likely by the fall. I have received conflicting advice on when to disclose. A lawyer advised disclosing now. An employment rehab counselor recommended waiting until return to office. I can self-accommodate until then. Another person mentioned that the optics of waiting until I return to the office might be unfavorable and to disclose now. What is your recommendation?
So I guess I can feel that one. I think following up on my prior answer, and without actually giving any legal advice, disclaimer, I would say that I think, again, approaching your employer sooner rather than later is probably a better option for the reasons I mentioned, which is that the process can take a little while. And I would hate to see a situation where you're back to work and already feeling like you need an accommodation, and you're not able to get one immediately. So I do think starting the process with giving yourself enough time to figure out what accommodations you actually need and what accommodations your employer is able to give you would probably be beneficial to both parties.
Yes. Another question is, how much input, in the process do you recommend the neurologist have in this whole process?
So I don't have any specific, I don't know if Anne does, medical recommendations. I think it's helpful for your employer to give them as much information as you're comfortable giving them in order for them to understand exactly what your limitations are. Because you don't want them leaping to conclusions about what your limitations are if they're not correct about those. You certainly don't want them thinking that there are aspects of your job that you're not able to perform that you are. And conversely, you don't want them thinking that you can do certain things that you don't feel like you're able to do anymore. So I think that giving them specific information from a healthcare provider can really only help you in terms of formulating the appropriate accommodation. But obviously, I think it's up to each individual to figure out what their, how many specifics they're comfortable disclosing, and probably your doctor would be able to fashion something, appropriate that worked with your particular limitations, but that helped you keep some privacy around your medical condition.
Yeah, I would agree with Alex. I don't have much to add to that, but just having the backup in terms of needing the accommodations for your specific symptoms may be helpful, especially if it's sort of one of the invisibles. Certainly the fatigue and pain are the challenging ones to quote unquote prove. So having a medical documentation backing you up, I think is a good one.
Good. Another question is, how can an employee who experiences a slow cognitive decline avoid being fired for performance-related problems?
So that's a tough one. I wouldn't say that at any given point anyone can avoid being fired, just because employees are employees at will, and your employer, has the ability to make employment decisions, so long as they are following the law. So what I would say is that it is very important, if you feel as though right now, even if you're experiencing cognitive decline, you are in fact still able to perform your job, and there are accommodations that you can think of that would help you in doing that. Certainly seek out those accommodations, because one of the things about the ADA that is helpful is that once you raise these things, you've certainly put your employer on notice that you have a disability, and they are required to engage in the process. And to the extent that it seems as though they're taking adverse action against you, either on the basis of your disability or because you've requested an accommodation, the law protects you. So I think it is helpful to have the conversation with your employer for that reason too, which is that, again, it puts the employer on notice and it really affords you protections once you've done that. But I would certainly talk, to a neurologist or whomever about what particular accommodations may be helpful in a situation in which there's cognitive decline. I mean, I can actually speak from personal experience. My father had Parkinson's and did in fact experience cognitive decline. And one of the things his employer did, he was a college professor, and he was no longer able to teach in the classroom. So they moved him to an admin position for a little while. So there are certainly things that employers can do if you're ready, willing, and able to work in order to accommodate you. Although one thing I didn't say during the presentation that I think is important to mention is that the size of your employer may also be very important, because often larger employers are able to make more accommodations than smaller employers, simply because of personnel related reasons and financial reasons. And as I mentioned, the employer has a duty to accommodate you unless doing that would cause an undue hardship. And so one of the things the employer is allowed to raise is that either financially or from a personnel perspective, it's just not possible for them to make that accommodation. But I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, we've always advocated, just as you would see your physician regularly is also seeing therapy regularly, because both occupational therapy and speech therapy address cognition, and having, regular check-ins with a cognitive evaluation, things like that may help you to determine when it is becoming, more difficult than is reasonable, or, and they'll work with you in the meantime for the accommodations to maybe help with strategies and technology to help you with the cognitive challenges you're experiencing. So that regular intervals, every 6 months or whatever they recommend, can be really valuable in helping you guide that decision.
Thank you. One of the next questions is in changing jobs. And, as I think about this, there are a lot of, I think, points and implications. One of which might be, what is the obligation of the previous employer to share information, and what is the, suggestion for the employee or potential employee to share information, and what are those questions that the potential employer might ask during the interview process?
So I think it's a three-part question. The first part is what might your prior employer share? The answer is nothing. Your prior employer not only is not obligated to share anything, they're obligated not to share anything. And so there would be no disclosure from prior job to potential new job. With respect to what you should share, I think that is, Bill, was that the second question? I'm sorry, the second part of the question? Okay.
Yes.
I think that's entirely up to the applicant. So if there is a written job description in the job announcement, if there are things that you already know that may be difficult for you, you feel that you can perform the job, the essential functions of the job, but you know that there are just going to be certain things either about the office setup or something along those lines that are going to be challenging for you, that's certainly something you can and should raise in the application process, again, because that puts the employer on notice and and really protects you under the law from the moment that you say that you can do this job, you just need this particular accommodation. And the employer cannot, during the application process, really ask you any questions with respect to any medical condition, whether or not it's something that they perceive you might have, or whether you've told them you might have. But you can talk about, to the extent you raise issues about potential accommodations, that you can certainly have that discussion. But during an interview process, an employer shouldn't be making assumptions about any sort of physical or mental impairments that an applicant may have.
Good. One of the next questions is, as one goes through the process of accommodation, how does one make the decision when it's time to pursue a disability retirement rather than future accommodations?
I would say that that is really just a very individualized decision and depends very much on whether you feel you have exhausted your options at work with respect to what kinds of accommodations may work for you. I would certainly, I understand everyone's job is very important to them. It's a big part of their lives, and I would certainly encourage you to explore that as fully as possible. To determine whether in fact you can keep working, but absolutely people reach a point where they feel either that their disability is simply just preventing them from being able to continue working, or that the job they're in is something they can no longer do because of their disability. And I think at that point it's probably helpful to start exploring other options with respect to going out on disability.
Good. Thank you. Another question is regarding disability. The question is, I think I'm considering disability as the pandemic has really challenged me. Where do I start the process?
So I am not a disability specialist at all, meaning disability insurance. That's not something that I know a whole lot about, but there are lawyers who specialize in disability. I know that if you contact the APDA, the Mass chapter, we're able to give some recommendations for people who deal specifically in that area. But you can also just start talking to human resources if you're currently employed, because it may be that you're covered by your employer under a long-term disability policy that might be applicable. So I would start there, and I would definitely consult with an attorney to figure out what your options are, because I do know that the process can be very nuanced and often kind of confusing. So I think that it's important to consult with someone who's able to take you through all the steps, because I gather there are many, and someone who can help you with that.
Good. I think that might be all for our questions for today. Anne, if you could please pull up those last two slides, I really would appreciate it. I want to thank both of our presenters today. Incredible job by both Anne and Alex. We certainly are fortunate to have individuals, such as Anne and Alex as part of our organization, both Alex as a board member and Anne as a partner. As we move forward, we'd like to continue doing these presentations. In order to do that, I want to make everybody aware of something very important to us, which is the Optimism Walk. The 2021 walk is planned for Saturday, May 22nd, and you can sign up for that walk online. The funds raised from the walk are used not only for us to provide research and information referral network here in Massachusetts, but also to provide programs and services to the community, especially during this virtual environment. If you have any questions that remain, please certainly reach out to the information and the Information Referral Center. Actually, I have one more question, if you don't mind, Alex. I just got a late question that I think is important, Alex and Ann. Once I have notified my employer of my Parkinson's disease, will that help protect my ability to participate in my employer's long-term disability?
I don't actually know, again, because I don't practice in the disability insurance space. I don't know the answer to that, but generally speaking, I would say that simply notifying your employer of a diagnosis doesn't really bear a relationship to the disability aspect of things. And when I say disability, I mean in this context, disability insurance. It helps if you notify your employer about the diagnosis, it helps protect you under the ADA, which is the law that I was talking about before, the Americans with Disabilities Act, so that your employer, then you're protected and your employer can't discriminate against you on the basis of that disability. But I don't think that it bears a specific relationship to the insurance piece. I would talk to somebody a little bit more, who practices in that area.
Yes. So I want to thank everybody for attending today's presentation. Today's presentation was recorded. Our plan is to share today's presentation. If you haven't already, please see us on all of the social media on the screen, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and at apdama.org. We'll also plan to get this up on our YouTube page. If you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, please do that. This is a very, very important month, as it's Parkinson's Disease Awareness Month. We have a lot of activities planned and we're sharing a lot of information. Again, I want to thank each one of the presenters today, Alex Deal and Ann Muskopf, for a fantastic job. We're very, very fortunate to have you as part of the APDA of Massachusetts chapter. I also want to thank Kathy Thomas and Rosemary Owen for their back-end support. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day today. And if you have any additional questions, please reach out to the Information Referral Center, 800-651-8466, or visit us at apdama.org, or email us at apdama@apdaparkinson.org. Again, I want to thank Alex and Ann for a wonderful presentation today.